Great, welcome everybody. Interpreters, please begin.
Thank you so much. Muchas gracias. Buenas tardes a todos. Yo me llamo Talis. Venimos representando a Tilde. Estoy aquí con mi cointérprete Andrea y vamos a ofrecer interpretación simultánea al español durante el webinario del día de hoy. Y para acceder a la interpretación, si están aquí a través de una computadora, hay un globito en la parte inferior, en medio, que dice interpretación. Pueden hacer clic ahí y ahí van a poder seleccionar su canal de preferencia, inglés o español, en el que prefieran escuchar el webinario. Si están aquí a través de un teléfono inteligente, hay 3 puntitos en la parte inferior derecha que dicen más. Pueden hacer clic ahí y ahí van a poder seleccionar interpretación de idiomas y de nuevo seleccionar su canal de preferencia. Si son bilingües, no necesitan seleccionar un canal, pero si prefieren escuchar la presentación en español, por favor adelante y seleccionen el canal de español. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Talis. I am here with my co-interpreter, Andrea, and we will be offering simultaneous interpretation between English and Spanish during today's webinar, mainly into Spanish. But to access interpretation for everybody that would like to listen, who is not bilingual in English and Spanish, there's a little globe at the bottom center of your screen that says interpretation. You can click there, and there you'll be able to select your channel of preference, English or Spanish. If you're here via a smartphone, there are 3 little dots at the bottom right corner of your Zoom app that say more. You can click there, once again, select language interpretation, and once again, you can select your channel of preference. Si hay algún problema con la interpretación, por favor, déjenos saber a través del chat y les ayudaremos en cuanto podamos. And just a friendly reminder to all the presenters to please speak at a moderate pace so that we can keep up with you and interpret everything you're saying in real time into Spanish. And if there are any issues with interpretation, just let us know through the chat and we will help you out as soon as we can. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. I'm Heidi Notario. I'm the Vice President of Strategic Partnerships and Systems Change with the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. And I'd like to welcome all of you to today's webinar. But before I do more of an introduction, I'd like to review some brief housekeeping notes with everyone. We are committed to making this an equitable space in which people of all abilities can participate fully and in their preferred language. This takes everyone's commitment and effort to make a reality. For example, we have limited use of the chat function. It's difficult to translate the chat in real time and can be inaccessible to assistive devices. Please send questions, comments, or resources directly to the event hosts and co-hosts. We'll read the questions or comments aloud so they can be interpreted. While we aim to make this a mixed ability and multilingual space, we also know we are still learning how to do this well. Please reach out to the event staff during the webinar if you are experiencing any accessibility challenges. We'll also ask about accessibility in our post-webinar evaluation. Please let us know your experience and ways we can improve. We know we have much to learn and we want to improve our practice. This event features live captioning. You can access this feature by clicking caption at the bottom of your screen. We are recording the event and will share it through our website and YouTube channels. The Q&A feature provides an opportunity for attendees to enter questions for the presenters to respond to. And please reach out to our staff if you are experiencing ongoing technical challenges, but note we may have limited capacity to resolve those while the webinar is running. So with that, once again, I would like to welcome to today's webinar and share with you our excitement to have here with us a presenter from one of the coalitions in the country. This webinar is being brought to you as part of the work by the Domestic Violence and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium that is comprised of a number of technical assistance providers, Collaborative Solutions, the Corporation for Supportive Housing, the National Network to End Domestic Violence, the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence, the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, the Safe Housing Alliance, Safety, Training, Technical Assistance, Resources, and Support, the Indigenous Safe Housing Center, and also by federal partners that make this work possible. The Family Violence Prevention and Services Programs under HHS, the Office of Special Needs Assistance Programs under HUD, the Office for Victims of Crime from the Department of Justice, and the Office on Violence Against Women, and the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. This webinar is part of the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence commitment to seeking pathways to permanent housing for survivors. And when we speak of permanent housing, we're talking about safe, accessible, and affordable housing for survivors, and ways in which we can interrupt the cycle of housing insecurity in which many survivors find themselves trapped throughout their lifetime. So today we're going to hear concrete ways in which organizations make this a reality for survivors and have done concrete efforts to expand housing inventory using creative resources within their states and figure out ways to support survivors' abilities to secure housing and also think of wealth building opportunities. So we're talking here beyond the voucher system. We're not saying that the voucher system hasn't saved lives and made housing a possibility for many survivors, but we are finding ourselves at times in which it's really important to think ahead and think of ways to support survivors in securing, maintaining, and gaining access and true pathways to wealth building opportunities and permanent housing. And without any more delays, I'm going to turn it over to our Director of Community Engagement, Lavon Morris-Grant.
Thank you so much, Heidi. I appreciate you and thank you for that great introduction and welcome into this space. Hello, everyone. I am Lavon Morris-Grant. I am the Director of Community Engagement at the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. And I can't begin to tell you all, if you can't see by my face, how excited I am to host this particular webinar and to have all of us come together to engage in this important work in the ways in which we can provide some needed information to the field and figure out how we can begin to answer and provide the resources for survivors as they've been asking us to. So I hope you all will enjoy what we will bring and get the information that you need from this webinar, and make sure you utilize the Q&A function of this webinar so that we may be able to collaborate with you even after this recording is done. So again, thank you for being here, and just let you know why we are doing this. But before I get into that, I would love to bring my guest on to have her introduce who she is. And Andrea, if you don't mind taking the mic.
Great. Thank you, Lavon. And thank you all for allowing me to be here and providing space for me to share about the housing work that we're doing in Kentucky. My name again is Andrea Miller. I am on the senior leadership team at the Kentucky Coalition Against Domestic Violence, which we have literally just changed our name this week to 0V, which is Kentucky United Against Violence. So Lavon had the surprise look there on her face because yes, it just happened, press release and everything. So please forgive me If you're from Kentucky, and I refer to us as KCADV, we are now 0V, but the work is still the same, supporting survivors as they move forward in their lives. I have been with the coalition for 13 years. I believe it's 13 years now. All of my work has been about supporting survivors in economic empowerment and housing.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I appreciate that. And just a quick bit, as my work in the community engagement in the housing space with the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence, I've been with the organization for a little over a year now. But as far as the work within the movement, I've been doing this work for over 27 years. I can't believe I've been here that long, but I know a lot of us have, and still trying to move the needle to begin to solve the issues of domestic violence in families' lives, and provide some sustainable, affordable, accessible, safe housing, and particularly permanent housing, which is one of the main reasons why this webinar is important to me, is to provide and figure out ways how to help survivors gather their way into permanent housing, not just shelter and not just transitional housing. And also because we as a field, we need to move to other options. As Heidi stated, we're not trying to take away the voucher system. We're not trying to take away anything, but we are trying to make a shift in the years of us doing this work and how we bring in other options, because survivors are asking us for that, and they have been asking us for that for a long time. And we believe permanent housing is a really great solution, and one, ending homelessness and also decreasing the violence in families' lives. So with that being said, we would like to, or I will begin to open it up for Andrea to start the presentation. And again, please utilize the Q&A sections as questions come to you. Thank you.
Great. I think we need to move the slide forward. And we're watching a video.
Homelessness is an issue that far too many people face. People of color, specifically Black people, other persons of color, and Indigenous people, experience homelessness in a dramatically different way than their white counterparts. People who hold multiple identities, such as those who live at the intersections of disability, immigration status, sexual orientation, gender identity, and more, experience compounded barriers that further homelessness and housing instability. A recent study found that 66% of people experiencing homelessness were Black, while 28% were white. Black individuals are only 13% of the U.S. general population, compared to 74% of those who are white. Rates of homelessness within Native communities are 3 to 8 times higher than that of the general population. In total, 78% of people experiencing homelessness identified as people of color. This overrepresentation of Indigenous, Black, and other people of color experiencing homelessness cannot be explained by poverty or identity alone. Structural racism, historical policies, institutional practices, and cultural narratives that perpetuate racial inequity put people of color at a disadvantage in obtaining safe and affordable housing. Statistically, women of color are much more likely to experience domestic and sexual violence, and survivors often face network impoverishment. Network impoverishment occurs when the addition of a financially distressed household member places an extra strain on family resources. Oftentimes, we tell a survivor experiencing homelessness to go to a relative or friend's house. However, network impoverishment can cause immense burdens on the existing limited finances and available support from that network. Racial disparities arise at every juncture, from the legal system, to housing, to healthcare, to child welfare, to public benefits. Understanding the intersections between domestic and sexual violence, racism, and homelessness, and applying an equity, survivor-centered lens in our work is the only pathway to stability, safe housing, and healing for all survivors. If we want to address racial inequity, we have to acknowledge it, learn about it, and talk about it so we can do more about it together. To learn more, visit safehousingpartnerships.org.
Thank you so much for that. And with that slide, with that video, like I said, if you have any questions, we'll be glad to answer those as we go along. And so now we will be able to get into the presentation with Andrea.
Okay, so I'm going to start by talking about case 0V, our development work. This is going to take some getting used to, so please bear with me. I would like to say that we've benefited with the development work that we've done because of the vision of our coalition leaders, Sherry Currens, who was our first and only executive director for over 30 years, and our current CEO, Angela Yanelli, and the hard work and persistence of Mary O'Doherty, who is now heading up the Ohio Domestic Violence Network. So Mary, if any of you or your staff are on here, shouting out to you. This wouldn't have been possible without all of the hard work that you did and our board. So I want to make sure that I acknowledge that this wouldn't have been possible without the vision of a lot of people looking at what is needed in our state and what we need to provide survivors with what they need. So if you want to go to the next slide, please. So this is Kentucky, our shape, and we have developed over the past 12 years, 84 units of housing, permanent housing for survivors of domestic violence using low-income housing tax credits, or LIHTC. With the support from the consortium and the National Network to End Domestic Violence, we also wrote a white paper that kind of outlined our development journey over the years. And we've participated in a few webinars in the past that highlight our development work and our housing work in general. In our state, and where these little purple dots are where these units are located. They are in the area development districts. Kentucky has 15 of those. And we have a member program that includes an emergency shelter in each one of those area development districts. So 5 of our member programs partnered with us to help build these tax credit units with developers. And we've served over 250 families in these units since 2011. If you want to go to the next slide. This is in Louisville, Kentucky, with the Center for Women and Families, which is KCADV's member program in Louisville. The rental assistance that goes along with this development is provided with a partnership through the Louisville Metro Housing Authority. And as part of this project, survivors who move into those units after staying in that unit for a year's lease time, they can leave with a permanent voucher to use anywhere else in Louisville's service area. We call those graduation vouchers, just because that's what Louisville calls them. But again, persons who move in and are provided with supports while they're living in that structure, which is literally right across this parking lot from the Center for Women and Families. So there are supports that are provided for all of the survivors in those. You want to go to the next slide, please. This is in Moorhead, Kentucky. So this is a very rural area of Kentucky. And these are townhouse style units that are literally, again, right next to the member program, which is Doves of Gateway. And this was part of that first development that we had. And there are 6 units in this area. And the rental assistance that goes along with those supportive services and that tax credit development are provided through housing grants that come through Doves and through our coalition. If you want to go to the next slide. And again, part of that first development, this is in Paducah, Kentucky. There are 12 units there, and then there are another 8 in Murray, which is about an hour away. These are also townhouse style developments, and the rental assistance in the Paducah area is provided with a partnership through the City of Paducah, Section 8. And this is similar to in Louisville, where that graduation voucher, or if you're in that development for at least a year, you can leave there with a permanent voucher if you need one or want one, and port that anywhere in the state or out of state. But you can leave with that permanent voucher. Go to the next slide. This is our second development. So I'm going to back up a little in my talking and talk about how that first development happened. So our coalition leaders went to our state housing partner, and we were asking for help for survivors of domestic violence that went beyond just a voucher program or voucher set-asides. The chairman of that board at that time, his name was Don Ball. He's a very huge housing developer in Kentucky. He has since passed away, but he had added to the stock of affordable housing in our state through all of his efforts, including his work with the Kentucky Housing Corporation. So he basically arranged to give us tax credits. We didn't even know what that was. We were like learning along this journey. Next thing we know, we had developers reaching out to us saying, hey, you've got these tax credits. Let's build some units with them. So those first 48 units we wanted across the state. It's a scattered site. And I just shared again where they are. There are 20 in Western Kentucky, 6 in Eastern Kentucky in the central part, and another 21 up in Louisville, Kentucky. And that first development was intended to be larger, but as tax credits work and as developments are put together, sometimes there's changes in that process. So we ended up with 48 units across the state, and all of them opened up in 2011 for occupancy. After we had been operating them for a few years, we thought, you know what, we can do this tax credit development. We should build some more. And so we did. And we thought, well, let's go back to Kentucky Housing Corporation and let's ask them for more tax credits. And they said, well, you have to apply now. And we can talk in detail a little about what the application process looks like. So we learned more about that. We did apply. The original development that we had proposed was selected, but then again, things happened, and we ended up with this development in central Kentucky in Lexington. There are 24 apartments. 12 of them are located behind the shelter, which is a working farm. It's one of KCDV's member programs called Greenhouse 17. And that development opened up in December of 2016 and February of 2017 for occupancy. The 12 that are behind the shelter opened up in February, and then the other 12, which are in Lexington's city limits, are on the bus line. They are accessible to jobs and shopping much more so than the working farm, and there are 12 units that were rehabbed as part of that 24 unit development. That development came together it's a $4.6 million project, and it came together with the low income housing tax credits, low interest loan from the state's Affordable Housing Trust Fund. The local government contributed about $500,000 to that, and another $560,000 came through the Affordable Housing Trust Fund in the state. And these are single story cottage, these outside ones. They kind of fit into the feel of the area. And then, like I said before, the other 12 are located within the city. If you want to move to the next slide, this is the cottage units that are on the farm outside behind the shelter. If you want to go to the next slide. The last project that we've developed opened up for occupancy in November of 2019. It actually came about, again, changing. And I want to talk about this change just to highlight how you might have a plan or a vision of how you want something to go forward, but be prepared for it to be different. And then this is what every one of ours has turned out this way. Every one of the developments that we've done, we might have started out in one direction, but we ended up with where we are now in these pictures that you're seeing. There was a fair housing complaint that caused our first plan to kind of fizzle, but it was settled, and rightfully and good so, we have this new development here. And this was a $2.78 million project in the Appalachian Mountains in Hazard, Kentucky. The development piece of it is really all about partnerships, starting with your vision that you have for the units that you would want in your area, where you get the property and the land, what you design and what you build, how you support that and sustain it, and how you move forward with all the learning that happens when you build housing and you are building that so that survivors can have safe, affordable housing that allows them to live with stability and dignity and autonomy. Our goal in building all of our tax credit units was to have a sense of community for the families who live in the developments. We have resident meetings on a regular basis, send out surveys to residents that we can gain anonymous feedback on services and what improvements the survivors that are living there, what they recommend, like what do we really need to be successful. And then the families in our tax credit developments represent about half of the family in our housing. I'll talk more about our other housing programs later, but we serve another 100 families or so through continuum of care, rapid rehousing programming, home tenant-based rental assistance or home TBRA. And then over the years, we've braided funding together to be able to operate the housing. And we're always looking for ways that we can help survivors build wealth and do some asset building and again, maintain safe and affordable housing. Some other things, if you want to go to the next slide about housing, we wanted all of our housing to, I mean, I hesitate to just say be really nice, but they are beautiful. They're beautifully designed. The project architect, Jim Burris, waived most of his fees for all of the developments, designed all the units in all of these projects. They are all energy efficient apartments and they are equipped with all appliances, microwaves, dishwashers, washers, dryers. The project sites all have playgrounds with picnic tables and benches and grills. All the units are Energy Star certified with Energy Star appliances and furnaces, high efficiency plumbing, toilets, showers, and faucets, as well as argon-filled gas windows and energy efficient lighting. Some of the lessons that we have learned in looking at our future developments that we want would be to include meeting space on site, wellness options like walking trails, workout centers, workout rooms, on-site or nearby childcare. So some of the things that we're thinking about as we've built these 84 are how can we make them even better? And what else can we do? And again, so these pictures of interior of units, the one up at the top is the interior and hazard, along with that playground there. And then the washers and dryers, just a photo there. So if you want to move to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about funding. And I think we wanted to open it up to some questions or comments about this. And before we go there, I just want to say one last thing about property management. We do have property management, a property management company that works with us on all of these tax credit units because of the compliance that's required by IRS for developments like this. We also wanted input into who is moving into these units. In the video that we saw earlier, there are a lot of barriers that people have in coming into housing, especially survivors. So we wanted to have no application fees, no credit checks, no criminal history situations that were going to keep someone from being housed. We didn't care what a person's housing history. It's not that we didn't care, it's that we don't want that to be a barrier for someone to be able to access this housing. We didn't want it to have a strong impact on the tenant selection process. So we modified the tenant selection plan to be significantly less restrictive than any of those that you find in a general housing situation. Our programs and our property management company, we work together on a regular and consistent basis to ensure the vacancies are filled as smoothly as possible and that we resolve problems. If there are any problems with people being able to pay a share of rent if they have one, if there are maintenance issues, we want our property manager to stay on top of those. If there are any issues going on in the development, we want to make sure that we're trying to preserve housing and stay on top of that so that we can support residents and address the issues before it would lead to an eviction like you might see in a normal situation, right or wrong. We don't want to see that happening and we don't want people to lose their housing. So we're all about the support and in always trying to preserve housing. So here's our chance, Lavon, to talk about questions.
Andrea, first of all, just thank you so very much. Every time I'm in talking with you, the presentation, I learn a little something more and more. So thank you so very much for that great job. And we will be coming back to the remainder of the presentation. But what we would like to do now is open it up for you all, please, to send your questions in. I know we have a few in the Q&A section, and I'm hoping and sure that many of you have more questions concerning housing, since it is one of the #1 priorities that survivors are asking us for. And so before we get to the Q&A with the audience, Andrea, I have a question or two for you first to start off this discussion. And so Andrea, in all of the years you've been doing this work, and I know the Kentucky Coalition, you all changed your name, but I don't remember it at this moment. So please forgive me for that. But in all the years you've been doing this work, Andrea, and being in this field, and you work at a coalition in particularly, what is one of the main reasons why you think our field, our movement should be in the housing space?
I think you said it just a moment ago when you said that housing is the #1 need that survivors share, usually when they're approaching a shelter or calling a support line. Literally, housing is the #1 thing that people need. So if we're not in the work of providing housing or figuring out how to better access and make housing more efficient for survivors, I kind of like, I'm asking, well, what's the point? We really need to be involved in housing. It's in short supply. It's absolutely what people need. You can't do anything else if you're not safely housed.
Right, exactly, Andrea. And we all know we are in a serious housing crisis. Whether you are a victim of domestic violence or not, we are still, and not just the crisis of there being limited housing, we are also in the crisis of housing being unaffordable.
Correct.
And that is a huge issue that came out of the pandemic of, COVID pandemic, that people cannot even access housing, even if they are able to find it, because of the expense of it. No matter how much money you wrap together, just the security deposits of asking for 5 times or 3 times people's salaries is so exuberant of an amount for folks to meet that criteria. So Andrea, thank you for that. I know some of the challenges, Andrea, that I've heard of why many domestic violence and sexual assault organizations are not in the housing space, as many of our homeless providers are, is because the challenges of working with, funders, and I get that, but what we have to understand, right, as advocates and advocacy and shaping policy, in order for us to be able to shape policy, to make the barriers lesser, we have to be at the tables,
right,
to be able to bring the information to the funders or to whomever is sponsoring us around housing of the needs of the constituents that we work for, right?
I totally agree.
Right, if we are not at the table, we can't then cry and scream later when they don't make room for us or shape housing in a way that makes it safe, accessible, permanent, and affordable for the constituents that we serve. And so I'm hoping as we move along this path of opening up or thinking about more options and other options other than just shelter and transitional housing, that people begin to, recognize that we have to do some things differently and add some of those options to make them become viable, and where we don't have only a handful of coalitions or a handful of programs providing inventory in housing for our constituents. So hopefully that will help us move this process along. And so with that, Andrea, I'm going to ask my colleague if she could read one of the first questions to us, and we can decide how it will be answered.
Sure. And before we do that, I think I could probably add a teeny bit to what you just said, which is low income housing tax credits, LIHTC. That is one way to do development. And it's a really important way because it is 100% designed to either acquire, construct, rehab affordable housing, rental housing for low and moderate income residents. And I think that there have been in the history of this over 2 million units across the country that have been built using this kind of structure, this low income housing tax credit. And so I think it's one way that we can increase the housing inventory and ensure that it remains affordable because of how that is constructed. So yeah, we can go to the next, or the first question from our audience.
All right. There are a few questions. Actually, there's a number of questions in both the chat box and the Q&A box. Also, I would like to remind people to please put your questions into the Q&A box so we can get to them. And then the first question that I'm going to ask is, what are some solutions we can look into when there are only temporary, i.e. 12-month housing in our programs?
Okay, so it's a good question. And sometimes that 12-month time limit is self-imposed. For example, in a rapid rehousing grant, you can use up to, the regulatory period is actually 24 months, but some local continuum of care tend to limit because there is a sense or a feeling that a person should be able to move forward after 12 months of rental help. And I will just share with you our experience and our independent evaluation when we first started moving into the rapid rehousing world where they have those time limits. We found that our population, our group of survivors, they were not stable and were not getting stable within that 12-month time frame. It took longer than that, typically an 18 to 24-month time frame, before the survivor household was able to build the things they needed to move forward with that housing stability. So I think limiting people to 3-month, 6-month, 12-month limits, if you don't have to do that, you should, I would say, let's not do that. I would also say that if it's the area or the continuum of care that's making that limit, I would advocate to expand it. It's self-imposed. Do I think that rapid rehousing in and of itself is a solution for all populations? No, because I think that sometimes people need more than even the 24-month regulatory period that's offered through rapid rehousing. But I think that if we're not at the table and we're not learning what these regulations are and where they come from, we can't actually start the movement to change them. So I think that's the first piece is, where do you go and who do you learn? Where do you get that information from? I'll also say for us, we started with our state housing finance partner with, let's look at affordable housing stock. We were looking at actual building housing. And when we built the housing, then we looked at, well, how can we support the housing with rental subsidies? Because people coming into our projects were very, very low income. So I think that those are pieces that you have to look at all the different opportunities that are out there and make sure you're, again, at the table having conversations and expressing what the needs are. So for me, that I hope that answers that question for the person about the 12-month limit.
Right. And just to add quickly to what Andrea was saying, especially too, for me, from a lived experience, for the question that the person asks about the 12-month limit, along with what Andrea said, I strongly suggest that your organization and all of our organizations, right, have good relationships with your funders and help your funders understand the barriers or the issues that survivors are facing. And 12 months, 24 months, first of all, there shouldn't be a limit. So I don't even want to say 24 months or whatever. People will heal or come to wherever they need to come to to feel like they can move forward whenever that happens. And we, as the advocates, have to be savvy enough to have these types of conversations with our funders and educate them on how those behaviors can look, right? How that survivor, and each survivor is different. Each survivor is different. So there's no one way fit all type of limit. And so I would really suggest heavily that that's something that we get out of the practice of doing, of accepting the limits and not pushing the envelope to as far as it can go, to open up these options for survivors to have the time they need to be where they need to be. So I'm just going to shorten it there, but we know we're not going to have a lot of time to get to every question, but we did want this to be engaging with your questions. So I'm going to stop for that question and allow for a second question to come in. Marlena?
Right. Next question. It's kind of a two-part one. It says, what percentage of DV survivors in the state have landed in these units or other forms of housing? And then the second part is, are these units accessible to those who have disabilities and those who are undocumented or precariously documented, if you will?
Right. So I'll take the second part first. So the second part is they're 100% open to anyone who has disability. There are units that are designed for someone who has mobility issues. And then there are others. So there are accessible units for people who have mobility issues, disability issues, those kinds of things. For people who are precariously, I like how that was framed, precariously documented, I think, yes, 100%. We actually, in tax credit world, that is an allowable thing. So as someone who is precariously documented does have access to those units and can stay there for usually through an immigration process, when they can then move on to another voucher program if they are eligible for that, or to another housing option. And sometimes that's being able to do market rent on their own. And the first part of the question was the percentage of domestic violence survivors in the state who have accessed them. So we've served over a couple hundred families. When we first looked into one of the rapid rehousing grants, so going through the continuum of care, we looked at the people who identified as survivor on the prioritization list that had required that people develop. We had a couple hundred households that identified as domestic violence on that prioritization list. I don't recall off the top of my head what the percentage of that was with the total homeless population within Kentucky, but our units are designed only for survivors. So you can't access our units unless you are a survivor household. So 100% of the people in the units have been survivors, but I don't know what percentage they are of Kentucky's population. You do have to remember, though, that these are only 84 units housing 84 households at a time. And then as that turnover happens, we can open them up to move more folks in, all of which, again, are survivors. I hope that answers what you're looking for. But I will say that we consistently run in our state. Actually, post-pandemic, our survivor households have increased that are on the prioritization list. So our housing assistance that we've been applying for, we've also been applying for more funding. And we have more than doubled our housing assistance money in our state with the DV bonus funding, which was a game changer for us in Kentucky and being able to provide services to survivors. In addition to applying for new projects, we have 3 continuum of care in Kentucky. We are involved in, the coalition is involved in housing grants with 2 of them now. We'll probably maybe expand into the other if we feel the need, but right now that's being met by other organizations. So we're always looking to grow housing assistance in general. And we're also interested in building more housing inventory. So we did apply last year. We had 2 developments that we were hoping to get funding for. They weren't selected. They were very small and very rural. And right now the state is investing its money in larger developments. So that's still a challenge for us, but we're going to continue to look at how can we make our applications more, I don't know, attractive, to able to build, and just kind of continue to explain, you know, yes, you can build these large developments, but we also need smaller developments in more rural areas. Kentucky is a very rural state. So we're going to encourage our state finance agency that when those allocation plans are developed, which are usually every 2 years, we'll be looking to kind of build in or help build in more special type projects that are for smaller development. I don't think anybody asked me that, but I would just share that anyway. So there you go.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Andrea. Marlena, I think I have a question that I'm going to throw to Andrea from the chat, and it is about pets. Andrea is asking, what about survivors who have pets? That is an issue I ran into when I was trying to escape. Are there programs that help with your pets?
So yeah, there's a couple of different things there. So first of all, we are certainly following fair housing, which absolutely says people who have a service animal or people who have an emotional support animal can have that in the housing, even if our property manager's lease agreement says no pets. So what we do is we work with the survivors who have pets. We try to get them classified as an emotional support animal. And I don't know how many pet owners there are on this call, but I would tell you my furry family absolutely provides support for me. So if I can get a medical professional to sign off that I need that support animal for a mental health reason, like anxiety or depression or whatever, I can get my furry family member in my household under that guideline. If we can't do that for some reason, certainly there are fostering programs and things like that where you might put your pet with another household for a short period of time until that can be set up. But I would just say that we have never denied anyone access to the housing. Usually what happens is we try to explain it ahead of time so that people aren't sneaking their animals in. It's just, we want everybody to understand what the rules and regulations are around that. So I would say we encourage it because we recognize the need. And I would just say that one of our member shelters just recently said they've just given up on the whole pet thing anyway. If you've got a pet, bring it in. They don't care. They're making it work. As long as, you know, we were taking care of them and there's no harm to anyone, it's just bring them on. So I think we kind of have that little bit of approach in our housing as well. I will tell you that we recently had someone who had chickens in one of our units. And that's one of my favorite stories because I'm just like initially really chickens, but okay, so let's figure out what's happening here. We eventually found out that this resident was chicken sitting for her sister. And we were like, okay, well, we were talking about building a chicken coop out in the back. Is this something that this person is using as a way to barter or gain income? So I really think that anytime something's happening in a unit, the best way to solve it is just ask questions and then see if we can solve it. So I was all about building a chicken coop. I was literally going to do that outside of one of the property, thinking it would be a cool thing for everybody to be involved. So pets, yes, but we do have some rules that we try to follow.
And so, Andrea, yes, the chicken coop, that is so awesome how you were going to use your advocacy to make that happen, but to find out something different. There are so many great questions in the Q&A. I am floored and thankful for the amount of questions, but I know we won't get to all of them, but I do have another one that I flagged that I would like to ask you. Andrea, and let me make sure. Yes, here it is. And then I think there's one more after this before we get back into the slides, just for the sake of time. But we'll see how that goes, right? And I have so many questions, but I really want to give space for the Q&A. What are some of the biggest challenges that you have faced in providing housing for survivors of domestic violence?
There are definitely challenges. I think the most difficult ones involve lease violations. So like I said earlier, our mission is to always try to preserve housing for that particular survivor across all of our housing programs and in our housing developments. We sometimes find that people move people into the unit without that person being on the lease. The person that's being moved into the unit tends to be a violent partner. It triggers other people. I know sometimes we don't want to use those words trigger, but it can definitely cause difficulty for other residents in the community in the tax credit development. One of the first things we try to find out is, as the perpetrator kind of coerced their way or forced their way into this housing situation, and then what can we do to get them out? Sometimes that involves relocating the survivor to another household, where we're also looking at trying again to preserve safety. So I think that moving people in is one of the challenges that is often faced in housing. And we approach it always from the perspective of what's happening here. Can we show that this is part of a power and control issue? And what can we use to help the survivor preserve housing? Some other complicated issues sometimes revolve around substance use. We are not a sober living requirement, but if people are using, we try to practice harm reduction modeling, but we also want to make sure that that what's happening is not interfering with other people who are also living there. So I think those are challenges when lease violations or issues with a person are sometimes interfering with the rest of the development. Those are challenges, and we usually always are working this on a case-by-case kind of basis. And our policy is to always try to preserve housing whenever we can. One of the other challenges is non-payment of rent. If a person has a rental share, all of our housing is modeled on a Section 8 model, which is that residents who are moving in have a 30% share of their income that they pay towards their total housing cost, which includes utilities. If residents aren't able to cover their share, we have ways that we can, we have imposed that policy. So we work around if there are issues there, like we can work on budgeting with folks to kind of see, can we adjust the voucher? Can we eliminate that? And we can. Can we, what else can we do? And let's just make sure that we're not putting undue burdens on folks with any of the policies that we have. So those are some of the challenges that tend to crop up most frequently is our financial issues, leasing, especially the moving other people in or having other people over, is even if they're not living there, they're over there consistently causing issues. And the substance use, I think, are the biggest ones that we tend to see. You're muted, Lavon.
I am. Thank you, Andrea. It sounds like a lot of the challenges are some of the same challenges people would have just being out in regular leasing. Is nothing new just because they are victims or survivors of domestic violence. People bring their human behaviors with them, right? And their human habits.
They do.
And so we just as advocates, we just figure out ways to adjust to those things and not make them such heavy barriers to where our first thought of action is to evict them, right? As they would do in the in other type of housing units of landlords, right? That the first thing is to evict people who are creating these issues for that landlord. And so before we get back to the presentation, like I said, we have so many questions, but I do have one more. And then Marlene, if you have a question that you would like to ask after this one, that'll be the last question. And then we'll go back into the presentation. And so this question, Andrea, is this, I really like this one. How have your places been received by surrounding neighbors and community members?
Yeah, that's the NIMBY part, right? The not in my backyard.
Yeah.
So you may have remembered that I shared we had an issue in our hazard development where we wanted to build tax credit housing in a particular area. And in the zoning change meeting, in the city committee meeting, they were very vocal about they didn't want those people living in this space next to, I think it was a funeral home. Now I could talk about that for a while, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to say, they said those people would be not doing anything and would be sitting around in the units, smoking and drinking, I think were the exact words, in addition to referring to them as those people, talking about survivors. They wrote that down in the meeting minutes. So the person who took the meeting minutes wrote that down. We reached out to Fair Housing and we were just kind of saying, this is what happened. And the attorney for our Fair Housing Council that serves the entire state was like, yeah, I'm pretty sure I can take care of this for you. And so he did. We filed a suit against the city for discrimination against fair housing. And as soon as the suit was delivered to the city of Hazard, they called us on the phone and said, so how can we make this go away? And we were like, you can give us some space to build our units. So they did. So I think that in some ways, that was an example of how it wasn't necessarily first received well. But those units are built on a location where an affordable housing development had actually burned down. So it's in a beautiful space and a beautiful spot. And the residents there, since they have been built, have been wonderful. There might have been a few hiccups here and there, as there are in any housing experience, but it's gone very well. With the second development that we had with the Lexington area, the 12 units that were built on the back of the shelter that has this working farm, there were concerns by some of the neighbors who are pretty well-off horse farm owners in the state of Kentucky. But the executive director over that program was able to meet with people, show them what this development was going to look like and how it was going to fit into the landscape of the community. And so we had community support for that one, but it took a little bit of showing and saying, here's what this is going to be like. So it's a great question. And I think that sometimes you might need to get your fair housing folks involved. And sometimes you might be able to just handle it by having a conversation with somebody. So that's been our experience.
Thank you for that, Andrea. That is awesome how that turned around to y'all's advantage and
Work out.
Right at the end to the survivor, right?
Yes.
And so with that, I'm going to see if Marlena has a question they would like to ask from the audience and then move us back into the presentation.
Sure.
Give me a second, because I know that you all are trying to move back into.
Right.
So there's a lot of questions about leveraging federal dollars.
Mm-hmm.
Can you hold those questions, Marlena, because we're going to Andrea will be talking about that in the next few slides, and then we can go more. I saw a lot of those questions and I skipped over them because we're going to actually, that's going to be the next section that we're going into.
And I will let you continue on with your slide deck.
Oh, okay then. Okay, so thank you for that, Marlena. So we can continue back with the slides, and Andrea, the floor is yours again.
Okay, you can move that one forward. So we've already talked a little bit about this and why we got into the housing business. It was because it is the number one thing that survivors need. We need more housing in our state. And so we also looked at how we can support that housing. So we've when you get into housing and when you start developing housing, you have control. And I think that sometimes that can be a really helpful thing in making sure that programs work the way that you want them to, and make sure that survivors get the services that they need across the state. And so that's another reason why to get into housing business, because then you can also educate your housing communities on things like fair housing and and working with people to mitigate eviction. So let's move that slide forward a little bit here. So right now, this is kind of the progression of how housing worked in our state. So we started with the tax credit developments. And in order to fund rental assistance in those, we started out with home tenant-based rental assistance, or home TBRA. So this is a voucher-based program that comes through home funds through HUD, and it provides rental assistance, security deposits, utility deposits, and/or utility assistance for eligible households. So we started with home TBRA. We had enough to, we asked for enough and received enough to support people moving into our developments. And then we also had some to support other people out in the community. We've been operating home TBRA, which in Kentucky is a 2-year cycle. We've been doing that since 2011 when our first award came about. Home TBRA, we love it. It's a great part or layer of our housing assistance programming. We moved somewhere around 2015, I believe, into the balance of state with the Continuum of Care Rapid Rehousing program. And we started off with a small rapid rehousing grant that we intended to serve in the balance of state, which is 118 of Kentucky's 120 counties. Then we actually took on at the same time another rapid rehousing grant that was initially awarded to one of our member programs, but they felt like they didn't have the capacity to run it. So they asked us if we wanted to take it on. So we did that. So we had 2 rapid rehousing programs that we ran concurrently. And then we combined them into one grant. It took about 2 years to get that go through HUD, but we did that. And then DV Bonus World came along. And for those of you who are familiar with that, we talked about it in our state. We went to our board. The board was like, hey, why doesn't the coalition go ahead and apply for this? And one of our member programs agreed to also apply. So we took the annual renewer demand, or the ARD amount that Kentucky was allowed to apply for. We applied for all of it between the 2 projects, and they were both funded. They've been renewed every year since then, and we applied for additional funding during the next year's expansion. So I think we're on our 3rd expansion now. So we have a little over $2 million in housing money, which when we got our first grant that was like $300,000, and we saw also what was coming in our state, we're like, that's a lot of money. And I know there are many other states out there, and you probably have way more money that you might have. For us, this was a big deal. It literally was game changing again for us. So we're right now looking at that as the model. We've been sticking with rapid rehousing because we've been able to make it work. We usually have about 98 to 100% exits to permanent housing from those rapid rehousing grants. We give people the maximum amount of time that we can in those rapid rehousing grants. And we also have a really good network of moving people onto a permanent housing program aside from rapid rehousing. So that's our track record with it. And we start out at the beginning, connecting people to permanent housing options, and then supporting them while they're rebuilding. And I think that was a question earlier with these 12-month limitations. We want to give people as much time as they can with the supports that these grants offer, so that they can go on to either another voucher program or market rent, whatever works for that household. We've had families graduate. I use the word graduate. I don't really mean that in that way, but maybe I should just say leave. We've had people leave our project to become homeowners, and that's always pretty exciting. So if you want to move to the next slide.
Andrea, before we get to this slide, can we go back real quick?
Sure.
To this previous slide?
Mm-hmm.
And just to ask a question or 2 here.
Sure.
Because I know there were a lot of questions in the chat about funding, and particularly, and I know we're coming up to an end quickly, and I wanted to ensure that we got some of those questions in, but I thought this was a good place to do that. Can you, Andrea, explain briefly a few things, but the first one starting with what is home TBRA? Can you explain and what those initials stand for again, and or that acronym, right? And what does that stand for, and how does that work in the development for housing?
Okay, yeah, sure. So home TBRA, TBRA stands for tenant-based rental assistance. So it is a tenant-based model where a resident goes and picks a unit that falls within a payment standard that is set by your grantee. So for us, we're a sub-grantee of the home funds that come through HUD into the state of Kentucky. And so our state housing finance partner manages those home funds. Some home funds are actually for home building, and some of them are for home repair. And then some are for rental assistance. And so we are applying for the rental assistance piece of this, which it can be used in our tax credit development. It can be used to pay rental assistance on behalf of a resident who's going to move into our tax credit unit. It could also be used somewhere else out in the community, keeping in mind that tenant-based really means the tenant has the choice. So even though we have these tax credit developments and we might have a vacancy, if the tenant who's in our program doesn't want to live there, they don't have to live there. We can't make people live there. So they can choose to live in the community. A lot of people will choose these tax credit developments because they're really nice. Then they're new and they have all these cool things. But yeah, it's the tenant's choice where they use that voucher. It is a voucher program. It does require that we follow that voucher model, which is, again, it's a Section 8 based model where people pay 30% of their adjusted gross income towards their housing costs. Now, people who are very low income don't really pay 30% of their adjusted gross income. They're paying a smaller piece of that. And that's because it's designed to help people not be overburdened by rent in the unit that they're choosing. It does, again, have that payment standard cap, which in Kentucky is 110% of the FMR or fair market rent. That's what the home TBRA kind of limits you to. For the balance of state, COC rapid rehousing, we also use the same rental assistance model. We're following Section 8. And that's because most of the people in our project go on to a voucher program. We have a lot of people who are extremely poor. We're talking less than 30% of the area median income for most of the people in our housing. So when they leave housing, they're typically going to a permanent voucher that is either a Section 8 voucher or something like a Section 8 voucher, like a veterans voucher or a HOPWA maybe, which is the housing for persons with AIDS, or some other, again, permanent voucher program. So we follow that same model of the 30% adjusted gross income there. But in a rapid rehousing program, you're not capped at a payment standard. We just use that as a guideline. And it's because those are based on rent reasonable. So in an area of the state where there might be housing that's more expensive than your fair market rents, you can use rent reasonableness just to show that, well, this unit that this person has selected it might be above a fair market rent, but we're not capped at a fair market rent, at least in our community and our COCs. I've heard of other COCs where they cap rents for people. I think that's a mistake because I think it limits people to housing that is already limited. Like you said earlier, we're in a national housing crisis. So we really need to be figuring out how we can get people housed using these funds. And there are ways to do that. And then the DV bonus rapid rehousing runs the same as our project that comes through our collaborative applicant, where we're a sub-grantee of them. I'm hoping that answered the questions because we can talk. I can go in the weeds of this all day. Yeah.
That is so great. And so what I'm going to do here, I'm going to I'm gonna make a statement, and then I'm going to ask Marlena if they see a few questions around the funding piece to bring into the discussion, because I'm sure many people would like to know that portion of it. But my statement that I wanted to make for us as a field and in general, right, is to please, from the DV and SA perspective, to please get familiar in your areas with your COCs. And the COCs are continuums of care. I know a lot of us in this space don't know about the COCs, but it is so important for us to be connected and build relationships with our COCs and balance of state so that we can have a seat at the table to learn and find out what's happening, what monies are available, how we can utilize that money, and how we can have a say in bringing down the barriers for survivors that we are working with. And so that is really important, and also important why we need to, as a movement, as a field, to be a part of the housing conversation and helping to guide those conversations and the way funding is being met. And so with that, the last thing I wanted to ask Andrea before I bring in Marlena was, Andrea, and you did a great job with this, but if there's a way that you can explain to the audience what we call braided funding. So with all these categories that are here, how what is braided funding and how did you all make it work?
So for us, the braided funding piece is you have some funding streams that will allow you to do this piece. And then others that you could maybe pull in that will help you do this other piece. So for example, to use the first two on this slide, when we did the tax credit development and those tax credit projects pulled together funding streams to get those units built, part of getting a development approved is what is your rental plan and what is your supportive service plan for the people that are going to be living in those developments. And so the development itself doesn't pay the rent for folks. And so we already know that most of the people that we're working with are, they sometimes come in at zero income. So who's going to pay the rent? The rent still has to be collected because that's how you keep the project moving forward and going on, and how you pay your property manager. So for us, we were looking at, well, what subsidy programs are out there that could be used to do rental assistance in those developments? And that was where we had our partnerships with Section 8 in some of the communities where they agreed to give us vouchers for those units, which are the equivalent of like a project-based voucher program. So as long as you live there, you get the rental assistance. And then you might remember that I said that some of them then, once they no longer want to live there after they've fulfilled that first year of a lease, they get a voucher that they can take with them and go. That's an awesome outcome and partnership for someone who might need that for the length of time that they do. So we started with the home TBRA as a rental assistance option. At the same time that we had the home TBRA that was going to provide our rental assistance, we needed to provide supportive services. So we looked at an OVW transitional housing grant as a way to provide supportive services only. So when we wrote the OVW transitional housing grant, it was to pay this for the staff to provide the supportive services for the people living in the development whose rent was being paid by either Section 8 or home TBRA. So that's an example of leveraging those kinds of funding sources, different ones out there, to support the work that you're doing. In the same way that we had applied for OVW transitional housing funds for 3 different cycles, those are 3-year grants, so that took us about a decade. Then we had to look at, well, if we don't get OVW funding, then what else can we use? Well, there is rapid rehousing then, which has supportive service money in it, in addition to rental assistance. So that's another way that you can kind of pull another funding stream in to support your housing work if you are doing development, or if you are just using those housing grants to provide supports for people in the community. And I think that we also have private funders that we have pulled in that you could also add as a braiding level to provide flexible funding. I think that anyone that's doing housing needs to figure out how to support survivors with needs that aren't covered by another traditional housing grant. And I think that that's another way to pull in a layer of funding. VOCA, or the VOCA money, the crime victims, that funding can provide money for staff that can be that can then support the folks that are living in your housing. So that's another layer of funding that you can add in. Some like in Kentucky also, we have we're a pass-through agency for contract funds for our state. So that's another funding source that then could be tied into how can you support the work that's in the development itself, like for staff or for needs. So there are other funding sources that can be used to support housing that you can leverage them together. It can be used to build them, and it can also be used to support them once they're built. And I think I had shared that with the developments that we built, there were several different pieces that went into some of those developments. Some of it was affordable housing trust funds, some of it was bonds, some of it was some home funds can be used for building and development if that's what your state allocation plan says. So for us, it was, and you can get really into the weeds with this, but like I said, we learned a lot of this along the way. And so that's, I think the best answer that I can give is to what is it you're trying to accomplish, and then who has got money out there that you can apply to receive. We've worked with lots of different, also private foundations that want to support the work. We've had a lot of success for our economic empowerment pieces in looking at foundation work to support that as another layer of best practice, I think, really.
Wow, Andrea, thank you so much for that extended example, which is what I hope it really helped, the audience see that there are other ways to braid funding, and, that is doable in spite of all the challenges. Is doable, and it's just a matter of figuring out how to make it work. I know there's a few questions, though there's a lot of questions that we're not going to get to, but I know there's a question or two that I wanted to go to the chat before we go back to the slide deck and bring this to a conclusion. And so Marlena, if you have a question that you wanted to ask.
Yeah, like you had mentioned, there are a number of questions into the chat. I know that you've already touched on this, but just an expansion of, did you have any experience utilizing home funds and or any other HUD funding to build units? And probably the more expansive version or question that's being asked is, what advice do you have for establishing relationships with developers?
So the first question about using home funds, yes, some of these developments actually did tap into some home funds to build. I think the Lexington development used home money to build. So yes, we have experience with that layering of, again, putting those developments together. It's not just all one source that money comes from. It's we have some pretty masterful, I think, folks at our state housing finance agency that help put these projects together, along with some of the developers that we've worked with. In terms of the developer piece or the developer relationship, I think if, the developer needs a nonprofit partner in order to be able to do a tax credit development. So if you make yourself that nonprofit partner, you don't have to be a co-developer like we have been. But we were like the best kind of co-developer because the guarantees for the tax credit investors actually came from our development partner. So we got a little bit of the credit there because we're also putting up rental assistance money and all that, but they need a nonprofit partner. So if you can talk about your vision and it aligns with what they want to build, or you guys can design that together, I think that's a way that you could design a project that would make you an attractive component to what a developer is trying to accomplish in your community. I think that the developers that we've worked with have been wonderful. We worked with housing partnerships out of Louisville, and we worked with the National Housing Alliance out of Ohio. We've had really great experiences with them. And the projects that we're trying to develop, one of our member programs is looking at their own tax credit development and working with a well-known developer. The mission is aligning, and that's what I think is really important with these partnerships, is that you have a mission alignment. I think that that's the way to kind of approach development, is to look at who's building what in your community and see if you can talk to them about being part of something new and unique in your area. So that's probably the best advice I would give is to, you could probably talk to your state finance partner too and find out what developers they've worked with and which ones they might recommend that you reach out to as a potential applicant partnership. Um, I think for us, those things, that's where we landed as we were looking with people that kind of aligned with what we wanted to accomplish.
And for that, Marlena, for the sake of time, because I really want Andrea to be able to talk about that last slide about one of their success stories, you can ask one more question if it's not too in-depth of an answer that Andrea would need to give, if you think it is.
Yeah, I talk too much.
Well, we're going to shorten it a little bit, Andrea. We can shorten it some.
Yeah,
So
I can.
let's see what
Very much.
Marlena has for us.
Most of these are very in-depth questions.
Okay, that's what I kind of thought, and I don't want to shortchange anyone in the answers. So what we will probably do with that is move into the last part of our last slide, to talk about as we come to a close, but we promise that all the questions that were put into the chat and in the Q&A, we will send out answers to those questions and possibly come back with a part 2 of this presentation. We will discuss that also. So for those of you who are still with us, if you would like to see a part 2 or have a part 2, just put a thumbs up in your chat or put a number 1 in the chat if that's something you think you would be interested in having a part 2. I see some coming in already, so thank you for that. Oh my God! So, so Andrea,
Seeing a lot there. You can move
yes.
to the next slide.
So let's write.
And then I think I've already shared this piece of it. You can move. Okay, so this is a story from one of our persons who moved into our tax credit unit after she had fled her abusive husband with her child there that's also pictured. And she's standing in front of the units that she's in. She's also standing in front of a Toyota Camry that she purchased. So when she first came into shelter, she needed housing. So there was the tax credit units right there. She's like, this looks awesome. Well, I'm gonna move in. Working with her advocate, she found out about an economic empowerment program that we had where we would match people's savings up to $2,000 with a dollar for dollar. So if they maximize the program, they could have $4,000 to purchase a vehicle. It took her about 9 months, I think, to save up that funding and to buy that car that's right behind her there. And then after she bought her car, she was able to get a better job. And so she was then able to move out of the tax credit units. She took a voucher with her. She went to other housing out in the community, got a better job, came off of Section 8 in the community. We also at that time had a federally funded program, which I wish the federal government would bring back, but it was called Assets for Independence, and it was called an Individual Development Account Program. We still had that program going up through 2019, and she used that program where her savings were matched 4 to 1. So she came out with $5,000, and she was able to buy a home. So she went from being homeless in about 2015 or so to being a homeowner in 2019, January of 2019. I feel like for a lot of the survivors that we work with who come in that space from homelessness to homeownership, it's usually about a 3 to 5 year journey. Most of the time it came with some sort of match savings program or match savings opportunity, and that housing and the supportive services that started them off on that journey. So to me, these stories, particularly hers and those like that, they happen when we meaningfully invest in people and help them achieve the goals that they have for themselves and for their families. So for her, it was giving her time and space to heal in safe, affordable housing that was nice for her and her child. And then connecting her with resources that could help her move forward. getting a job might be one, getting a better job might be one, education is another. So those things, I think, when we can layer all that together, we make change. And
That is awesome, Andrea. And I know, in us doing this work for as long as we've done this work, I know there are so many success stories like hers. And it's always good, to see that and document that and continue to move forward with those that will come behind her as she was able to move out of the unit and continue, doing good for herself. And the great thing for me in this is knowing that she was allowed the time that she needed. Didn't feel the pressures, right? From us as the advocates, from the programs, from the funders, from any of those other outside sources of her reaching her potential of when she was able to move out the units. And again, we cannot compare her story of moving out of the units to someone else who may have to stay a little longer.
Yeah, everybody's story is unique.
Exactly. And
everybody's story is unique.
And that's what we have to respect, not just as advocates, but just as human beings, right, doing this work to make the monies that's attached to the work that we do. We have to make the money make sense, right? We have to make the money relevant to the way people's lives are lived, and people's lives are not one-dimensional. And I know that's a big thing we as survivors been saying for so long. I don't have a one life dimension and I don't have a one life issue. and my issues are not happening one at a time. Many of my issues are happening simultaneously, even if it's different issues that's not connected to why I'm homeless or why I came to domestic violence organization for help. I could be having other kind of issues, happening. So all the core support services, Andrea, that you all are able to offer is an awesome guide. The domestic violence housing first is a great model to look through also, particularly because it offers the trauma. I just lost the name, my age. Oh my God. The care, trauma care. Oh my God. I just lost the name, Andrea, of how we offer trauma-informed care. That's what
right.
See it to come back. How we offer trauma-informed care in those pieces. And that piece has to follow in everything that we do. And also in talking with our funders of educating and help them understand as they work with us to offer more monies, into the spaces to get people housed and help them stay housed permanently and seeking that. And so with that, Andrea, I am so thankful. And I know we have so much more we can cover. And based on those numbers of people saying they would love a part 2, we will look to see how to make that happen and how soon we can make that happen. So in closing, I just want to say that, just want to read this last piece as we close of understanding the intersections between domestic violence, sexual violence, racism, and homelessness, and applying an equity survivor-centered lens in our work is the only pathway to stability, safe housing, and healing for all survivors. If we want to address racial equity, we have to acknowledge it, learn about it, and talk about it so we can do more about it together. So that comes from the video you all saw earlier, and I wanted to bring that back to your remembrance as we take this webinar to a closing. And of anything, this could not have happened without all of y'all's participation. We are so thankful to you all for be here with us and engaging your questions with us in this so sought after discussion that has to continue. So please take this out of the webinar and take it back into your organizations and into your communities and continue the conversations. Thank you so very much. And we hope to catch you on the next one. Have a
Thank
great
you, everybody. Thank you, and feel free to reach out and we'll get back to you. Right, Lavon?
Yes, we will.